Well, from now on, the police minister will no longer have the power to fire the head of the Independent Police Investigative Directorate. Instead, it will have to be done by Parliament. Let's discuss the significance of this move. We're joined by Tait, who is the Director of African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. We're also joined in this conversation by Kimera Chetty from the Helen Suzman Foundation. They're still pursuing a court case relating to the termination of contracts of IPID personnel. Perhaps, Sean, let me begin with you. It's a significant move, of course, and it lifts then the role of IPID from being between, having to rely on good relationships between the head of that institution and the police ministry to completely then having full powers by Parliament.
It moves in that direction, but there are deficits and silences which really make the IPID Act, or continue to make the IPID Act problematic. So yes, we are moving, we are seeing some kind of movement towards the Constitutional Court pronouncement around greater independence, but it leaves much to be desired.
And let's talk about what some of those gaps are.
Well, it doesn't give any process around how a removal could take place. It simply says that Parliament will do that, but it doesn't give any guidance around, is the director able to witnesses? How long will that process take? By what time must Parliament respond? None of that is provided. It doesn't let you know what happens in the case of a suspension. Is there a difference between non-renewal of the contract, suspension, dismissal? Each of those areas is silent. And then for us, a really big concern is around appointment. There are no directions around appointment. It still lies very much in the hands of the ministry and an affirmation by the committee afterwards.
Sure. Kimera, let me bring you into the conversation. I wonder what your take is, and if at all you agree with Sean in terms of some of the shortcomings of this piece of legislation.
Entirely. I think this is a really disappointing piece of legislation that we see Parliament hand over to the President for signature, and unfortunate that it's now enacted. And just some history. This goes back to 2016. With the Constitutional Court case that challenged the minister's power to remove, to suspend and remove the executive director of IPID. And so what that court case did is give Parliament 24 months since September 2016 to fix the IPID Act. And what we're seeing now, 4 years later, is what Parliament has done is essentially read in one small paragraph that only speaks to the removal powers and nothing about what Sean just said about all these other gaps. It's an incredibly thin piece of legislation and doesn't benefit IPID at all, unfortunately.
Sure. And ultimately, of course, IPID needs to be a strong institution that can stand on its own. So in the absence of that, in the absence of the legislation that empowers it to be that, Sean, what then become the consequences?
Well, we need to look at independence broadly, and it's independence in law and in fact. It's independence underpinned by the ability of the organization to perform, that it has the right caliber of people and that it has the finances and funding to be able to do this. And it's woefully under-resourced in all areas, from the ability to draw on forensic and ballistics support and evidence to its investigators, to the accessibility of the office. And if we're serious about a strong, independent policing oversight body, then these issues really need to be addressed, along with the very important functions around the appointment and the dismissal of the executive director.
Sure. Kimera, many people will be asking themselves how this legislation and the changes that it brings or doesn't bring at IPID ultimately affects their own lives and perhaps the experience that they may have with the South African Police Service. Perhaps speak to us a little bit about that.
Sure, and I mean, just to clarify, when that time period given by the court to Parliament to fix the Act expired, that order from the court took effect, right? So what that means is that as soon as those 24 months expired, the minister could no longer, remove the executive director, whether there was an IPID Act amended or not. So when we got that judgment was when we saw this take effect. So this is not Parliament doing something new or radical or revolutionary. This is Parliament firstly way behind its own timeline, and secondly, all it did was read into the Act something. So to answer your question about what changes, nothing fundamentally changes for the operation of the organization, because those questions that Sean talks about all the ways in which the institution should be strengthened through independence, and really what that judgment gave Parliament as a guideline for what to consider, have been ignored. All of the submissions made by civil society in the public consultation process when this bill was being deliberated upon by the Fifth Parliament have been ignored. And so this is something that the South African public must be very aware of when hearing this Act is now passed. What changes? Nothing really, I don't think.
And I imagine that that's not good news, because IPID itself is responsible for investigating the work of some officers who are not doing their jobs according to their codes of conduct or even the ethics of their profession. Sean, what does it do then to have a police force that has this body that isn't quite able to get to the levels of accountability in holding the police force itself accountable, really?
We just keep on passing the buck backwards and forwards. For a police organization, they're very easily able to say, well, we do have an IPID. It will take care of criminality. It will take care of serious misconduct and abuses within the police. And IPID saying, well, we have limitations. We simply can't reach all of those cases. And so you're backwards and forwards between the two. We are in a very difficult situation at the moment as we deal with the COVID-19, as we deal with trying to flatten the curve. And we've seen a lot of issues being raised around conduct of police and the military. And it has stressed the importance of IPID and the importance of having strong accountability mechanisms in place. We really need to step up to this. And unfortunately, the resourcing, structuring, and the deficits in the IPID Act hold us back on that. We're also with an organization that has been without an executive head for, a good few months now. And it's demoralizing to have an acting head and then that acting head being changed, and the impact that it has on the strategy going forward, the ability of the organization to plan. Before Robert McBride was appointed, there was a long lapse again between the head of the organization. But before that, there were lapses in the appointments of the head of the organization. We saw the impact that it had on its performance. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And unfortunately, legislation is a very important part of getting it right.
And Kimera, what some have said, of course, is that the way that IPID is structured is almost tantamount to the police investigating themselves, because when it comes to some of the aspects of how these investigations are done, they also have to use the same pool of resources.
Sure. I think the resourcing and capacitation of IPID have long been on the agenda of both Parliament and the Executive. And like Sean said, these are pleas that have been coming from the organization, not just in terms of how it's able to operationalize, but also how it's able to staff itself and actually fulfill its own mandate in terms of statute. And so the difficulty IPID faces is all of the constraints that it's, in terms of its budget, but also in terms of its staffing. And what we see now with the ongoing confusion about the appointment processes of the executive director, it's an incredibly embattled organization, and a stronger piece of legislation that gives guidance, or at least, allows IPID to rely on things in law that it can use to buttress itself. This act doesn't do that, firstly, and it's going to be telling to see now going forward, now that the legislative process is over, so to speak, how the portfolio committee of police move on conducting oversight over IPID, but also then this relationship that you speak of between the Ministry of Police and IPID, how that goes forward, because it's a difficult, sometimes controversial relationship that we've seen played out between SAPS and IPID. IPID is both reliant on SAPS for a lot of the information it receives in order to process its complaints, but also, it's that conflicted position it finds itself of also having to investigate the police. And in the past, we've seen that relationship being incredibly fractious, with the High Court even saying, that elements within SAPS and IPID are sometimes responsible for sabotaging the investigations of each other. And so again, I take it back to what Sean says about legislation can be incredibly beneficial to strengthening an organization when it speaks to some of these issues. And so there's a lot more work to be done by Parliament.
All right, let's leave it there for tonight. Thank you both for your time. Kimera Chetty is with the Helen Suzman Foundation, and Tait, the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum Director.